The noise on the flight deck was a relentless, grinding symphony of steel and fury. It was the howl of turbines, the clang of chains, the constant, humid wind whipping across the deck of the USS Vanguard. Dominating this chaos was the sound of one man's laughter, Captain Marcus Thorne, call sign Viper. He was a Top Gun graduate, the cockiest fighter jock in the air wing, a king in his small supersonic kingdom. He stood with his squadron, the Serpents, a golden circle of ego and arrogance, all snickering in unison. Thorne held a half-empty can of ice-cold Coca-Cola, sweat beading on the aluminum. His eyes were fixed on the small, unadorned figure of Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Hayes. She was bent over the experimental X-47 Aurora, a sleek, matte black alien dart that looked nothing like the familiar F-18s around them. Hayes was focused, her hands moving with quiet, technical grace across a sensor array on the fuselage. Her silence was what grated on Thorne. He saw it not as professionalism, but as weakness. He felt the need to correct it, to put the quiet, focused tech geek in her place. He tossed the Coke. It was a casual, low arc of pure contempt. The half-full can struck the small of her back with a wet, heavy smack. The explosion of sticky, dark liquid was instantaneous, staining the heavy olive-drab Nomex fabric, a shameful, spreading brown. The laughter of the Serpents erupted, louder now, a wave of casual cruelty washing over the deck. Thorne smirked, adjusting his sunglasses. He had expected her to jump, to flinch, maybe even to cry. He had expected a reaction that affirmed his power, but Hayes didn't flinch. She didn't drop her tools. She didn't even turn her head immediately. Her posture remained a study in absolute stillness, a deep breath drawn and held. The pause was excruciating. It was the methodical cessation of one task before beginning another, stripped of all human drama. She slowly straightened, her spine unnaturally rigid, a pillar of ice in the tropic heat. When she finally turned, her face was a serene mask. It was unnervingly young, framed by a tight regulation knot of hair. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held no anger, no fear, and certainly no challenge. They held only a calm, analytical light, observing Thorne as if he were a predictable, slightly irritating glitch in the system. She glanced down at the dark, sticky stain on her uniform, a public scar, then back at Thorne. "See? A little motivation helps with the clumsiness," Thorne broadcasted, his voice dripping with condescension. Hayes offered no reply. She retrieved a clean white rag from her kit and began to methodically blot the expensive, fire-retardant fabric. Her hands were steady, moving with the practiced grace of a concert pianist. The sheer, utter refusal to participate in the drama, to grant Thorne the satisfaction of a reaction, was more unsettling than any screamed retort. She was an immovable stone, and his ego, his torrent of dominance, simply flowed around her, leaving her untouched. The laughter died. The atmosphere shifted to an awkward, confused silence. Thorne shrugged, irritated by the lack of surrender. "Whatever," he muttered, turning to his men. "Let the tech geeks play with their toys. We've got real planes to fly." They swaggered away, leaving Hayes alone with the silent black machine. She finished cleaning, folded the stained rag with military precision, and returned to her pre-flight checklist. Her focus was absolute, her silence a deafening rebuke. Then the silence was shattered by raw panic. "Mayday! Mayday! Sky Eye 1 is tumbling. Catastrophic engine failure. Losing altitude. Payload is critical." The voice of the drone operator from Fleet Command was frantic, garbled, broken. On the bridge, Admiral Vance, the strike group commander, swore under his breath. On the main holographic display, the red icon for the RQ-180 reconnaissance drone began blinking, tracing a grim ballistic arc toward the mountainous border of a hostile nation. The drone carried the crown jewel of their intelligence, gathering time-sensitive imagery of a hidden missile site. If it crashed inside enemy territory, the intelligence would be lost. The geopolitical fallout would be catastrophic. 10 minutes, the ops officer yelled. Impact in less than 10 minutes. Our Hornets are too far out. A furial quiet fell over the bridge, a sense of total, abject failure. Then a new voice cut through the channel. Calm, technical, devoid of any emotion. It was as clear and steady as a carrier tone. Vanguard Actual, this is Chimera 1. I can get it. Heads whipped around. Chimera 1. The quiet pilot. The tech officer Thorne had just humiliated. Captain Thorne's voice immediately cut in, dripping with disbelief. With what? That science project. It's never even flown a live mission. You'll be shot down before you cross the border. Don't be a hero, Lieutenant. Admiral Vance slammed his hand down on the console, silencing Thorne with a single, sharp gesture. He stared at the screen, replaying the pilot's steady voice. It wasn't bravado. It was certainty. He remembered the impossible calm in her eyes earlier. Arrogance makes noise. Competence is quiet. Chimera 1, Vance rumbled. State your solution. There was a brief pause, filled only by the fading static of the doomed drone. Hypersonic intercept and mid-air magnetic grapple, Hayes's voice returned. I can match its descent vector and secure the asset before it reaches hostile airspace. Estimated time to intercept, 3 minutes, 32 seconds. The bridge was stunned into a profound silence. Hypersonic intercept, a maneuver that existed only in theoretical papers and flight simulators where the survival rate was less than 5%. It was pure, unadulterated science fiction. Thorne was yelling again, his voice cracking with fear and disbelief. Sir, you can't authorize this. The G-forces alone, it's a suicide run. But Vance wasn't listening. He gave the order. Chimera 1, you are weapons free. Execute the recovery. Godspeed, pilot. On the flight deck, the Aurora was already moving. The catapult fired. There was no roar. There was no thunder of afterburners. There was only a blinding flash of blue-white light, and a sound like the sky itself being ripped in half. The Aurora didn't launch. It vanished. It went from a dead stop on the catapult to a speck on the horizon in less than a second. On the tactical display, the icon for Chimera 1 didn't move across the map, it jumped. It blinked from the carrier's location to a point 100 miles away in a single refresh cycle. Mach 7, the ops officer shrieked. Climbing through 100,000 feet. She's outside the atmosphere. Inside the cockpit, Evelyn Hayes was perfectly serene. To her, the crushing acceleration was a familiar embrace. She was a master of a new kind of warfare, conditioned for speeds and altitudes that belonged to spacecraft. Her hands danced over the controls, adjusting the flight surfaces with inputs so fine the flight computer could barely keep up. She wasn't flying the Aurora, she was wearing it. It was an extension of her own absolute will. The tumbling drone grew rapidly in her view. She fired micro-thrusters, diving back into the upper atmosphere in a controlled hypersonic descent, shrouded in incandescent plasma. She was fighting physics. She was fighting forces that should have turned her body into a red smear. Engaging grapple, she stated calmly. A magnetic harness fired. For a heart-stopping second, it seemed to miss. Then, with a massive jolt, the magnets locked onto the drone's fuselage. The two objects, one a stable pinnacle of flight, the other a chaotic wreck, were now one. Hayes fought the controls, wrestling the combined mass back from its death spiral, pulling it into a steady glide just miles from the hostile border. On the Vanguard bridge, a collective gasp of disbelief gave way to a spontaneous, joyous roar of victory. The drone was saved. The impossible had been done. Captain Thorne, watching from the ready room, was silent. His face was pale. The smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He had just witnessed a miracle, something his entire career told him was impossible. "That's not possible," he whispered, feeling his world crumble. "No one can fly like that." The comm channel crackled one last time. "Vanguard Actual, Chimera 1. The package is secure, returning to base." As the Aurora landed with the grace of a falling leaf, an unprecedented event occurred. Admiral Vance left the bridge. He walked out onto the noisy, wind-swept flight deck, an act reserved only for the most solemn of occasions. The deck crew sensed the shift in gravity, parting before him. Captain Thorne and his squadron, drawn by the magnetic pull of the moment, stood in a stunned cluster, watching. The canopy hissed open. Evelyn Hayes descended, pulling off her helmet. She looked exactly as she had before, unassuming, calm, her uniform bearing the sticky, dark stain of old soda. But as her boots touched the deck, she found Admiral Vance standing directly in her path. Vance didn't speak a single word of greeting. Instead, the four-star Admiral came to the most rigid, formal position of attention he had executed in 30 years. His back was ramrod straight. His hand snapped to his brow in a salute so sharp, so precise, it was a work of art, a gesture of the deepest possible respect from a subordinate to a superior. "Welcome aboard the Vanguard, Admiral Hayes," Vance said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent deck. "My apologies for the informal reception you received from my air wing." The entire flight deck fell silent. Not a lieutenant commander. Admiral Hayes. Thorne felt the collective gaze of the entire carrier air wing burn into him. His knees felt weak. He watched the woman he had treated like a clumsy maid return the salute with quiet dignity. She was a Rear Admiral, the Director of Advanced Aviation Threat Response Command, a living legend from the classified Valkyrie program. The realization was a physical blow. Vance lowered his hand and turned his icy gaze upon Captain Marcus Thorne. "Captain Thorne, step forward." Thorne moved like a puppet with cut strings. His swagger was gone, replaced by a rigid, terrified posture. He stood before the two admirals, his horror complete. "You owe Admiral Hayes an apology," Vance stated, his voice pure ice. "Not just for your disgraceful conduct today, but for the depth of your professional ignorance. You just witnessed the finest aviator this Navy has produced in a generation. The woman you treated like a coffee runner literally wrote the book on hypersonic combat maneuvering that you will be required to study next year. You confused a lack of arrogance with a lack of ability. Admiral Hayes is a ghost. She and a handful of others like her are the reason men like you get to fly your real planes in relative safety." "Now," Vance commanded, letting the words crush Thorne, "you will render the appropriate courtesy to your superior officer." Thorne turned to Hayes. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended a mere professional reprimand. It was the existential shock of having his entire world demolished. "Admiral Hayes," he croaked, his voice barely audible. "Ma'am, I apologize. My conduct was unacceptable." Hayes simply met his gaze for a moment. Her expression was unreadable. Then she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not forgiveness. It was simply a dismissal. The transaction was complete. She had work to do. The stain on her flight suit, Viper's puddle, as the deck crew would later call it, became a permanent landmark of hubris. The story of the Coke can and the Ghost Admiral instantly spread, not like wildfire, but like a change in atmospheric pressure, altering the very culture of the carrier. It was a single perfect lesson, echoing through the hangar bay and ready rooms for years to come. The universe rewards precision. The only currency with universal value is competence, and the strength of a true master requires no announcement at all.